You know, as some of you may know, in my day-and-day life, I mostly report. Sometimes I analyze. I never do the forecast. There's the other guy that do that. But if I should have given the geopolitical forecast, I think it's safe to say it will be stormy, dusty, and hot. And I think that from all the things you said, there's one ideological, philosophical, or maybe also a practical question that's been raised. In such a weather forecast of being dusty and uncleared and hot, what should Israel do? One option is to stay put, do nothing, wait that the sky will clear and we will see the horizon. And the other one is to navigate, try to initiate, and to try to see what advantage can we draw from this stormy weather in the region. And my first question to you is a yes or no question. What do you think Israel should do? Wait and see, or initiate and act? Yes.
I don't believe in passivity. I think that passivity is bad for individuals and bad for countries. And I think that the founders of this state, when you consider the geopolitical situation of Israel when it was founded, which was atrocious almost beyond our imagination, and you study the diplomatic activity of its founders, you realize that even in the most dire circumstances, diplomatic means were found to create alliances of various kinds. I do not believe that Israel should sit and wait about anything. Certainly on the Palestinian question, tick-tock, tick-tock. I mean, it's, we all know why, so no, I think passivity is exactly what Israel should not do.
Mr. Ross?
I agree. I think, look, as an old policy planner, the one thing you're always thinking about is how do you deal in a situation where you expand your options, you don't allow your options to contract. If you sit back and do nothing, the one thing you can absolutely count on, you'll have fewer options and they'll be worse. There are areas where I think that it is important for Israel to be thinking creatively. They're not simple. None of the choices are going to be simple. In a time where you don't have the kind of strategic alliances that you might once had, I think thinking about what can be done vis-a-vis Turkey becomes more important, not less. I think on the Palestinian issue, I agree with Leon. The point is there is a clock that is ticking. At least look for the kinds of initiatives you can take. Either you or put yourself in a position where you get something done, or at least you change the context in a way where Israel has demonstrated it did what it could.
Ms. Harris Ali?
Act. Israel should act, and act on the short term, middle, long term, and have a long term vision. On the short term, I think the Israeli state and people have the right to protect themselves. How they do that is a question that they should answer. In the long term, again, I want to repeat, I am really thrilled by what's going on in the Arab world. The fact that the masses, whether it's the Islamists or not, but the masses, for the first time, are questioning and tackling absolute power. And that presents a great opportunity for Israel. And I agree with Leon, investment only in the vertical authority has always been a mistake and is a mistake. You don't make peace with an authoritarian ruler, you make peace with the people. And these changes create an opportunity that I think Israelis should grasp. And this is about changing hearts and minds. It's about affecting and encouraging what is now a minority, but I think may become a majority. And for the first time, successfully addressing the issue of absolute authority. I think these people can also learn to compromise. Young people at an impressionable age, and that is what the Arab youth is, are open to that. And I think there is a relatively large minority that do understand that religion simply does not have the answers to all questions. And this presents Israel with a great opportunity.
Major General Ashkenazi.
באופן עקרוני, מסתכלים על העשורים האחרונים, אז אני חושב שצריך לפעול. כשהייתי במדים, לא רק בתפקיד האחרון, אז באופן טבעי, לשוחח או לדבר על הנושאים הפוליטיים היה יותר רגיש, השתמשתי בסוג של מטאפורה. ואמרתי על מדיניות החוץ הישראלית, או על האופן שאנחנו מתנהלים, דימיתי את זה לנסיעה באוטובוס. אני חושב שבהרבה מהנושאים שהיו על הפרק ושעדיין על הפרק, כולנו יודעים מה התחנה הסופית, במקום לנסוע בקו הישיר, אנחנו נוסעים במאסף, עוצרים בתחנות לא חשובות או חיוניות, משלמים המון על הכרטיס, לפעמים אתה מקבל את התחושה שהנוסעים איבדו עניין, סגרו את החלון ולא אכפת להם, ואני אומר לך את זה בתור המאבטח של האוטובוס הזה, לא בתור הנהג שלו. ואני חושב שישראל היא מספיק, צריכה להיות מספיק בוגרת, בטוחה בעצמה, בשביל לקבל החלטות קשות. אני טוען שהאוטובוס הזה יכול לחצות את הצמתים בדרך המהירה, הם מאתגרים, הם לא פשוטים, אבל אפשר לעבור אותם בירוק. אתן לך דוגמה קונקרטית, אני חושב שאחרי 60 וכמה שנים, ישראל מספיק, צריכה להיות מספיק בטוחה בעצמה, למשל לקבוע את שאלת הגבולות שלה. אני חושב שזו גם שאלה לא רק ביטחונית, גם מוסרית. מה צריכים להיות הגבולות שלנו?
מכיוון שיש כאן consensus, there is a consensus here that Israel should act. Maybe one of the action is to do something about Iran. And I stay with you. Do you think that when people say act, it's not only about defining the borders and have a negotiation with the Palestinians, maybe for the first time to put the deterrence question or the deterrence issue on the table and say, yes, this is the most important issue, this is the most incremental threat that Israel should have, and now this is time to show our neighbors, our enemies, that Israel can walk the walk and not only talk the talk, and maybe Israel should, even with all the problems, take a military action against Iran in order to stop Iran from being nuclearized.
אני חושב שצריך לכבד את הכלל חשוב שנשמור מאחרי דלתות סגורות את הנושאים האופרטיביים, אבל באופן עקרוני אני חושב שימוש בכוח צבאי הוא לא מטרה בפני עצמה, הוא אמצעי. אני חושב שזה חשוב שזה יהיה באמת האמצעי האחרון רק שהחרב על הצוואר, ובשאלה הקונקרטית אני עדיין חושב שיש זמן לדיפלומטיה. אני חושב שצריך שיהיה אימון, שיהיה איום של שימוש באופציה צבאית ריאלי על השולחן. בהיעדרו לא רק המערב, אלא גם בעיקר איראן. אני חושב לא תשתכנע שזה רציני. דווקא כל מי שלא רוצה להגיע לאופציה הזאת, חייב לשמר אותה באופן ריאלי על השולחן.
והדיבורים שלך...
ובמובן הזה, אם נשים את ההקשר האיראני בתוך שעונים, אז אני בדרך כלל מתרגם את זה ל3 שעונים. יש את השעון של התוכנית האיראנית, יש את השעון של הסנקציות, והיה גם שעון של שינוי במשטר, שככה תקתק כשהצעירים האיראנים יצאו לרחוב. הבעיה שלנו היום, שהשעון שמתקתק הכי מהר זה השעון של התוכנית. אנחנו אותו צריכים להאיט, ואני לא ארחיב על זה, ואת השעון של הסנקציות אנחנו צריכים להאיץ, ואולי גם יתקתק מתישהו השעון של השינוי של המשטר. אני חושב שזה מה שעושים כרגע. כשהאופציה הצבאית צריכה לרחף מעל כולם. כל אמירה שמערערת את האפשרות הזאת פוגעת דווקא במי שלא מאמין שצריך להשתמש בה.
הייתה תחושה שאתה כרמטכ"ל וקבוצה של אנשים כמו ראש המוסד מאיר דגן בלמו סוג של ניסיון כזה של ראש הממשלה נתניהו ושר הביטחון ברק לפעול פעולה צבאית נגד איראן. א', האם היה מהלך כזה, והאם עצם העובדה שאתם נתפסים כמי שמדברים נגד מהלך כזה לא פוגעת אולי אפילו באסטרטגיה של הבלוף, כלומר אפילו אם ישראל לא מתכוונת לתקוף איזה סוג של בלוף, למה, why to call the bluff, כדי לשמור על האמינות של האיום.
אני לא אנסה לערער חלק מההנחות שהנחת כאן ובנית כאן איזושהי תמונה, אבל אני רק אומר לך שאני חושב שבאופן עקרוני הסוגיה הזאת צריכה להישאר מאחורי דלתות סגורות. אין לי ספק שיובל ומאיר מדברים מדם ליבם. אני אבל מצד שני רוצה לומר לך שאני חושב שזו אחת ההחלטות היותר קשות שעומדות בפני כל ממשלה ישראלית, לא רק הממשלה הנוכחית. ואני יכול לומר לך שבמובן של הדיאלוג בינינו לבין הדרג המדיני, אני חושב שהוא היה דיאלוג קבוע, שוטף. היו מחלוקות. ואני חושב שזה בסדר שהם היו. דווקא במקומות שלא מתקיים דיאלוג בין הדרג האסטרטגי הצבאי העליון לבין הדרג המדיני, אני חושב שזה מתכון לאפשרויות של ציפיות מוגזמות ממה אפשר להשיג למשל עם כוח צבאי או מה אי אפשר להשיג. לפעמים יש איזה סוג של שטחיות בהסתכלות על השימוש בכוח צבאי. הניסיון הצבאי שלי מראה דווקא שהבעיות שלנו צמחו במקומות שהיה פער בין מה שאנשים לפעמים היה נוח להם או רצו או מחוסר ידיעה חשבו שאפשר להשיג בשימוש של הכוח הצבאי. במובן הזה אני חושב שהחשש הזה כאן הוא לא כך קיים. אנשים מבינים, אני חושב, את הסוגיה שלפנינו בצורה מאוד מפורטת.
Mr. Ross, after the third round of talks with the Iranian in Moscow that ended yesterday, I think it's fair to say that it failed. I was trying to talk a little bit, there were some maneuvers and headlines, but they didn't give the resolve that the West want. When is the time, in your eyes, or what are the measures that the West and the United States will say, okay, been there, done that, it's not working, let's move on. And when you said move on to where? Is that necessarily to a military option?
I think the approach that the 5+1 has adopted was an approach based on step-by-step confidence building. Now, there's a logic to that. If, in fact, the six stay together, which they have, and you're seeking from the Iranians demonstrations that they have a peaceful intent with regard to their nuclear program, if you are able to produce the right kinds of steps, stop the clock, or if you're able at least to produce enough steps, it's going to tell you more fundamentally what is the purpose of the program, meaning does this program address what is the key answer that we want to know? Are the Iranians, at the end of the day, prepared to accept a civil nuclear power that cannot be converted into a nuclear weapons capability because they're prepared to accept the kinds of restrictions and limitations on their program that would preclude a breakout capability? The purpose of negotiation should be to reveal and answer that question. Step by step could get you there over time. It would be fine to do step by step if you had all the time in the world and you were using the increasing pressures on the Iranians from the economic sanctions to put them in a position where they're saying, all right, the price is just too high, now we're prepared to make the concessions.
So you suggest to try another strategy with the Iranian?
Yes. What I'm getting at is the idea, the step-by-step approach always had within it a kind of logic but also a built-in trap. That if you weren't getting enough from the Iranians on a step-by-step basis, and the position has been we're not going to engage in a phony process, you might have to cut it off prematurely before you actually have an answer to the question. Or if you keep it going, it looks like you're just keeping it going for the sake of having diplomacy but not for producing an answer. So my approach would be to pivot from the step-by-step approach and go towards making what I would call an endgame on the nuclear issue proposal. Put the Iranians on the spot in a way that either has them respond in the right way or unmask them. Meaning, are they prepared at the end of the day to accept the kind of limitations on their nuclear program that allows them to have civil nuclear power, which is what they say they want? If what they want is civil nuclear power, they can have it. But what they cannot have is a breakout capability to a nuclear weapons capacity. And putting this on the table puts them in a position where they have to respond and also does something else. If they say no, then you publicize it to the world. Because what I was saying before, and this is something that Gabi was just repeating as well, again, there is no military answer to this problem. This is a means, it's not an end. You can set the program back, but they can rebuild it unless you have them, in a sense, isolated and restricted by sanctions so that it becomes very costly for them to rebuild it. That's why any strategy that includes the use of force also has to have a strategy for what happens after you use force. If you're only talking about the use of force, then you're really not having a strategy that deals with this program.
Mr. Leon Wiesenthal.
Wait, can I just add something to, may I?
Yes.
No, are you sure? Yes.
I can ask you a question and then you can answer.
No, don't, because
right.
You're going to ask another question that makes it seem impatient that you want an Israeli strike.
Right.
No, I just wanted to say that the premise of both what Gabi and Dennis said, I think, obviously, is that any deal with the Iranians has to be with a government whose reliability we can count on. The problem, of course, is that the current government is not very reliable. We know that the most reliable answer to this solution would be a change of government in Tehran, but as Gabi said, the democracy clock is ticking much more slowly than the nuclear clock. The one thing I want to say is I have heard recently one thing that has disturbed me enormously. It may be utterly false. I hear utterly false things all the time. I live in Washington, D.C. And it is that a part of of some purported Israeli strategy in recognition of the political dimension of the Iranian nuclear program would be to target elements of the regime so as to cripple the regime as a part of. My own view is that if Israel thinks that it can bring about a new government in Tehran by attacking Tehran, and literally, if Israel thinks it can use airplanes to reorder the Iranian government, I think that would be a colossal mistake.
Yeah, but what I'm asking you is about how you're winning the street. You said, okay, we need to change these alliances, the vertical alliances. Okay, how are we winning the street after years of incitements, years of lies about Israel, about the Jews? You know what, let's take Iran for example. How are we going to tell the Iranian that we are on with the good guys, okay? How can,
I'm not so,
because we're waiting for 30 years for the student in Iran to raise up and take the mullahs down. It doesn't happening. Can we help them do that? Should we help them do that?
There are two dimensions to this. In the first place, in June 2009, something historic happened in Tehran. It cannot be put back in the bottle. The rebellion was a mass rebellion. It was brutally crushed. The President of the United States chose to do absolutely nothing to help the people in the streets of Tehran, even rhetorically, again, because he thought that the nuclear question was so urgent that we couldn't offend the Iranians by discussing human rights, even though we discussed human rights with the Soviet Union and discussed arms control at the same time for a very long time. So there is something happening in Tehran which all supporters of democracy, private and in government, must find ways to support. It's not simply the case that nothing is happening, but it is happening too slowly from the standpoint of Israel's security interest. With the Palestinians, I have to say, I'll say one thing. For many years, for many decades, I used to think that the settlements were the most important impediment to the peace process. After Hamas took over Gaza, and it was clear to me that there was a Palestinian civil war, I concluded that that was incorrect. That they are an impediment, but they may not be the largest, most substantial impediment. Now I have to tell you that if you intend to make peace with someone, what that person thinks about your behavior has to be an important part of your strategy. You cannot make peace with someone without understanding their definition of peace. It seems to me, whereas obviously there is a long way to go in fostering horizontal alliances with the Palestinians, even though Israelis and Palestinians occupy the tiniest bit of land imaginable together, I'm now convinced that it is a historic responsibility of the Israeli government finally to put an end to settlement activities so as to make it perfectly clear. I mean, aside from the fact that, whatever your analysis of the settlements is historically, and I find them strategically ludicrous, but as a matter of a horizontal alliance of Israelis and Palestinians beginning to understand each other, of the possibility of progress, it seems to me that the price of the settlement policy is spectacularly too high, and I think that has to be recognized.
Thanks. Ms. Khabri-Saleh, if I got you right, what you're saying is to some of these gentlemen, even if you want to initiate, if you want to do something in order to make the peace process sticking, you have to wait. You have to wait for Islam to change, to understand that compromise is an ideal thing and not an insult of losing face. And even if you want to make this clock go faster, you need to wait that process will come into the political Islam, and then you can make a real peace.
I don't know how to say this in a diplomatic way.
So say it not in a diplomatic way, which is the best way to put things.
I think that Israel and America can sit down with the Palestinians, with the Saudis, with even the Jordanians and Egyptians, until they're blue in the face. And Americans right now are really blue in the face, and I think Israel is even more blue in the hope of achieving peace. I think if all the 6 steps that Dennis proposed are demonstrated by the Israelis today, that is not going to gain you peace. So think of the Palestinian-Israeli equation, which is really a Jewish, it's been transformed from a small territorial problem into this civilizational ordeal. To achieve the kind of peace that we are talking about, you have to wait at least a generation, because the current elite has made it very clear over many decades that their definition of peace is not the same as how the Israelis and the Americans define peace.
You mean that in their eyes peace is that Israel will not exist?
You can give them Jerusalem and there'll be no peace. On the other side of the table, peace with Israel means to compromise. It is shameful. Peace with Israel, for them, is not a ticket to it's just not going to happen. That eventually will happen, but that is a long-term investment. But right now, peace is defined by the Islamists, I think by the Palestinians whose power matters, that Israel doesn't exist, and that's why they don't want to put it on the map. What we need to do is invest in a new generation, and I think that generation is budding. This is what is exciting about the Arab Spring, that there is a generation that is interested, maybe interested, a new elite, and that is a long-term investment.
Mr. Ashkenazi, let's speak a little bit about Syria. You know, some of the assumptions that we made here are all connected to Syria, because there is a question of whether what Israel should do regarding Syria. And I'm going back to my first question. Should we sit and wait what will happen until Assad will fall, or should we do something actively to make him fall? And that way it will hurt Iran, that sees Assad as one of his alliance, and get a better result, as you said, in Syria in dealing with weapons that go into Hezbollah. The former head of the Mossad, Meir Dagan's, 2 weeks ago said Israel should do something. Israel should make Assad fall. Do you agree?
באופן כללי, כן, כדאי שאסד ייפול, אבל השאלה היא לא רק מה ישראל רוצה להשיג, שאלה גם מה אפשר לעשות ומה המחירים של מה אפשר לעשות. בכלל, במקצוע שלנו יש קשר מאוד הדוק בין הישג גבוה לבין מחירים גבוהים. אני מתכוון לשימושים בכוח צבאי, אני לא מדבר על מדיניות חוץ במובן של דיפלומטיה. אתה שואל אותי אם זה נכון שישראל תתערב צבאית במה שקורה בסוריה, אני חושב שזה ממש לא נכון. אני חושב שזאת תהיה משגיאה, אני גם לא יודע אם מישהו המליץ את זה.
אבל בדרכים אחרות חשאיות.
אבל אני חושב שבדרכים אחרות אנחנו צריכים לפעול. אנחנו צריכים לפעול באופן שיכול לסייע למי שאנחנו מזהים. אם אנחנו מזהים כוחות מתונים, סורים למשל. אני חושב שלמשל אם יחסינו עם הטורקים היו היום במקום אחר, אז אני חושב שטורקיה וישראל יכלו לפעול באופן יותר מעשי, דיפלומטית, מדינית, באופן יותר אפקטיבי, לסייע נניח לעצב מציאות יותר נכונה, גם מהצד של הסורים וגם מהצד נניח של הישראל והטורקים. הבעיה שאין לנו את זה היום. זאת אומרת, אני לא מודע לכך שיחסינו עם הטורקים מאפשרים את המציאות הזאת. והדבר האחרון, אני חושב שהוא לקח לכולנו. אני גם מבין קצת את ההיסוס של המעצמות בהתערבות בתוך סוריה. אנחנו צריכים להבין שבסוף באמת מה שיקרה, לדעתי, מה שיקרה בסוריה, מה שיקרה במצרים, בעיקר יוכרע בטווח הארוך על ידי המצרים בעצמם. זאת תהיה בחירה שלהם, על ידי הסורים בעצמם. זאת תהיה בחירה שלהם, זה לא תהיה בחירה של מישהו מבחוץ. במובן הזה אני מתחבר לכל מי שאמר כאן ודיבר כאן על הפשרות שצריך לעשות ועל הדברים אחרים. זה מה שאנחנו צריכים שיקרה. תראה, מובארק למשל, שהוא היה נניח עוגן של יציבות, מונח שאני טבעתי. באמת לא הכין את הציבור המצרי לפשרה הגדולה. ואני חושב שזאת, במובן הזה הייתה טעות, אבל עדיין זה היה נכס אסטרטגי מבחינה ישראלית. והמחירים במזרח התיכון הם לא בין 1 ל-10, הם באמצע. אני חושב שכרגע לא נכון שנעשה שום דבר. צריך לפקח אחרי זה בצורה מאוד אדוקה, וזה מה שישראל עושה. ואני חושב שאני צריך לזהות סיכונים וסיכויים. נדמה לי שבתהליך בלונגרן, שינוי בסוריה, נקפל בתוכו סיכוי לשיפור מצבנו האסטרטגי בצפון.
Our time is up, but I will let you, Mr. Ross, to make the final word regarding Syria. And my question is a bit harsh. You know, if I'll be a voice for Syrians, simply Syrian guys, they say, you know, you Western countries, you're hypocrites. When it comes to oil and interest, you maneuver, you act. You did it in Afghanistan, you did it in Iraq. But when it comes to a country, you know, a poor country like Syria, which is only people that are being massacred every day, you do nothing. So what hope and what new tomorrow you really give us?
Look, I think that Syria confronts everybody with lots of dilemmas, there's no doubt. And it's you know, as we look at what's unfolding there, first there's a moral imperative to try to change the situation. Second, I hinted at when I was speaking, there's actually a strategic imperative as well. There's all sorts of good reasons, as I was also saying earlier, for us to be quite cautious about intervening with the use of force. It's always easy to get into places and not so easy to get out of them. And the United States has just extricated itself from one war in Iraq and is still in a war in Afghanistan. That said, I think one has to take a look at, are there options that we and others have that can accelerate the process of change there? The idea that we'll move the Russians, it's clearly going to be very difficult. I think one way to move the Russians is for them to understand that they might become irrelevant, that in fact there could be action taken without them, which is the last thing that Putin seems to want. We should be working with the Saudis and others also to be communicating with the Alawis, who Assad presents to them the image that he's their salvation. The truth is he's their threat. And there should be more of an effort to sort of separate them from him. But one way to do that, I think, also is to begin to think about acting on creating a safe haven in the north. We created in northern Iraq in 1991 a no-fly and what became a no-drive zone. If we were to be able to do that, and you obviously need Turkey's support, because you can't do it without Turkey's readiness to support it. If you were to do that, I think it would change the balance of power, not just objectively but subjectively. You're trying to create a tipping point within Syria to move things sooner rather than later, because my fear, the longer things go on, the worse it will get, not just from a moral standpoint, but from a strategic standpoint, including the fact that Syria could well become a failed state because the sectarian divide becomes so deep and so unbridgeable that you'll see the fragmentation of the state. When that happens, that's bad for everybody. And so from a strategic standpoint, there is a reason to accelerate the departure. If you're going to do that, I do think a safe haven in the north is something that could be done.
Thank you very much. Lady, gentlemen, thank you very much for your inspirational words. I have tons of other questions to you, but it will wait for another occasion, and thank you very much for this morning.